Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Spiritual Matters Thursdays here at the Daily Huddle. I am your host, Dr. Monikah Ogando, and I am so excited to talk to you today because we have a very insidious subject matter, darling. Yes, we're talking about, is vulnerability a liability or a superpower? And the reason I say it is an insidious matter is because we have all experienced vulnerability to one degree or another. And to that end, I have the perfect quote for you. It comes from Helen Keller, and she says, security is mostly a superstition. It does not exist in nature, nor do the children of men as a whole experience it. Avoiding danger is no safer in the long run than outright exposure. Life is either a daring adventure or nothing. Oh, welcome to the Daily Huddle.
And that quote is too cool.
Yeah.
And who said it makes it even more cool.
Exactly. Did I tell you about my love with drums?
No, tell me.
Did I tell you? Yeah. One of the reasons why I'm so excited about the intro music for the Daily Huddle is because it's just percussion. And everybody has a favorite song, and people would guess, and rightly so, that my favorite song would be a Prince song of some sort, because Prince is my absolute favorite of all time. And in fact, I did not go to a Beyonce concert because I refused to pay for concert tickets more expensive than I ever paid to go see Prince. But that's another sermon for another sermon. But my favorite song of all time is not a Prince song. It's actually Easy Lover by Phil Collins and Philip Bailey, because of the percussion in that song. And I could literally do like air drum, instead of lip syncing, air drum syncing to that song because I love the percussion so much. I'm a drum girl through and through. Sheila E., let's go. So today we're talking about vulnerability, and is it a liability or a superpower? And I'm just gonna give you my straight answer off the bat, and then we can massage it together, because now we know where Geo stands, and I'm gonna tell you what I feel. I'm gonna say hashtag stand for the and. Improperly placed, it could be a liability. And properly placed, it could be a superpower. Right? So that's my version of it depends. Is stand for the and. So here's what I mean about it.
I was kidding.
Nah, it was like but not really.
I really was leaning in an authentic comment will be vulnerability. It is a superpower.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it is a superpower used the right way.
Okay, well, and so now we get to define what the right way means, because I think sometimes that may be circumstantial. It may depend, you have to read the room, right? And also it depends on the quality of the relationship that you have with some people. With someone that you may not have trust or permission or access or intimacy with, sometimes a vulnerable share may seem like oversharing. It may seem like overstepping. And then for somebody else for whom you do have permission and trust and all of that other stuff, not showing up that way can seem like withholding, right? So it depends a lot on the relationship and what the expectations that you have, the comfort levels that you have with communicating certain things and so forth. So I'm gonna start so we're off of disclaimers. I'm gonna now start with the conversation around, I always talk about auditing your assumptions. And one of the first things that we do when we, ¿cómo se dice? Emprender, like when we begin a new topic or when we start, delving into a particular subject matter, we have to establish definitions, right? Parameters. That's how we know that we're operating from the same sheet of music, as it were. To continue with the musical, since we have musical threads, let's continue with the musical metaphors. And What that means is, if you have a different definition of vulnerability than I do, then we may be talking about different things, even though we're using the same word, right? And then on the other side of the spectrum of that challenge may be that we may be using different words and mean the same thing, right? Like somebody who speaks English may say love, somebody who speaks Spanish may say amor, and because it's two different words and they sound differently, you think you're talking about two different things, but you're actually addressing the same thing, just with different language. So what some people may call vulnerability, somebody else may call danger. Somebody else may call oversharing. Somebody else may call unnecessary exposure, as it were. And for the purposes of the Daily Huddle family, because we are emotionally intelligent and emotionally resilient people in this family, when you look up the dictionary, it says vulnerability is being open to harm. And I'm gonna step away from that definition. I'm gonna say that vulnerability is more like open to risk, which requires courage, right? So, for example, if you're in a romantic relationship, the person who says "I love you" first takes an emotional risk. That's vulnerable, right? Or if you've been in a long-term relationship and some stuff's not working, to be able to sit down and say, "Stop, this isn't working, but I don't want to leave." That takes also some risk and emotional courage. And following your dreams when you have no evidence that it might work or might not work, or maybe you've tried so many things and to try one more feels like an exercise in futility. That too requires courage and exposure to risk. And that's how we're defining, for the purposes of this discussion, vulnerability. And I'm going to ask you, everybody, huddle around. This is called Daily Huddle for a reason. Let me ask you a question. When people have been in your space, in a conversation, in physical proximity or whatever, and they've demonstrated some level of vulnerability, they have exposed themselves, they've revealed something, you've seen them cry, or you've seen them in a soft or tender or surrendered moment, open moment, or whatever. Did you feel disgusted by that level of emotional exposure? Or did you feel pulled in, like, wow, that's very courageous? Did you feel more intimate, more connected with that person? Or did you feel appalled and repelled and disgusted? 1 in the chat if you felt connected, 2 in the chat if you felt disgusted or repelled.
Say the question again.
When somebody has been vulnerable in front of you, right? They've cried or they've demonstrated some level of emotional exposure or whatever. When they've demonstrated vulnerability to you or in front of you, have you felt connected, pulled in, magnetized, or like, wow, present? Put a 1 in the chat if that was your experience. Put a 2 in the chat if you felt repelled or disgusted. And I'm getting a whole bunch of 1s. And yet, people, when it's our turn to be vulnerable, we're like, nah, I'm not gonna do that. They're gonna think I'm an idiot. They're gonna be repelled. They're gonna be disgusted. I'm gonna look like an idiot. Have you ever noticed that? That when it's your turn to be vulnerable, you're like, and no, and for later. Wait, am I the only one that reacts that way? What? All of you are just perfectly willing to be vulnerable? Of course, it is the Daily Huddle after all. Okay, let's talk about it. Let's talk about it. What has been your experience receiving vulnerability versus when it's your turn to express it? Yes, Gio.
No, I can start playing.
Okay.
So my experience of receiving vulnerability instead of me giving it,
Yes.
that is it has its, it depends.
Mm-hmm.
On occasions that it's a wonderful opportunity to get connected with someone in
Mm-hmm.
occasions, and that person is leading me, you know, it's being an example for me of what's possible in a relationship or in a conversation, to really authentically look at where the experience is at that moment. And usually I am moved by someone who does that, you know.
Mm.
And then I dive into it too, and then I play too, like, oh, I'm vulnerable too, I'm gonna go there with you. And then there are occasions where there's just, sometimes it occurs as vulnerability shows up as manipulation.
Oh,
And
say more about that.
yeah, like in occasions, someone's vulnerability comes across
Mm-hmm.
as a moment of avoiding responsibility.
Oh,
And so
okay.
I'm not going to take responsibility, but they won't say I'm not going to take responsibility. It's just, oh, I am in a really tough, difficult position. And
Uh-huh.
therefore I am, you know, in a vulnerable moment.
Right.
And then I need the attention in that. I need the attention and the compassion to be understood. And therefore I'm
Mm-hmm.
not going to take responsibility for something. And then when that is there, I also can feel it. And that's, then it's not moving, touching. It's fine.
Yeah.
It's
Now
like,
you're resentful. Now you're like, yeah, you try to get over.
yeah, then I'm like, no, I'm not going to be vulnerable like that. I have
Mm-hmm.
to really make an effort to be vulnerable. I am more inclined to confront
The
what's not,
shenanigans.
yeah,
There
or what's not being said. I'm more willing to confront what's not being said
you go.
and
Yeah.
ignore the vulnerable moment. And then they say to me, well, you don't care how I feel? I care, but it's not the priority.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a pink elephant in the room. Let's talk
Yeah.
about it. Right. Right. Exactly. I like what you're saying here, because it's an opportunity. I think confronting it is also very vulnerable. You
Yeah.
know, sometimes in the polite society, we don't say certain things, we don't confront certain things. There's a reason why certain things go unsaid, and you're over here saying it, breaking social constructs, you know. So that in itself is a vulnerable thing to do, I think, because it is a risk, right? At least a social risk. Laura says, I am only vulnerable with people who I trust. And so, okay, so now let's open that can of worms, right? Because how do you define trust? Right. And so for the purposes of this discussion, usually the socially acceptable definition of trust is that it is safe to be vulnerable with that person, right? That it'll be well received, or that it'll be held in confidentiality, or that it won't be weaponized against you, or that, to your point earlier, Giovanni, that this person isn't going to manipulate your vulnerability or your exposure and so forth, or their own. But I think that that level of risk is endemic to vulnerability, right? And so I'm going to define trust. Oh, I wasn't expecting to go there today, but okay, let's do it. Let's roll up our sleeves. I'm going to define trust as the ability to withstand uncertainty. So to the degree that I do not tolerate uncertainty from that other person, I don't trust them. To the degree that I do not tolerate the uncertainty from myself, I do not trust myself. And so if you are willing to tolerate uncertainty, then you trust everybody. And this feels a little bit more soothing when you understand universal law, universal principle of as within, so without, as above, so below. And you also understand that nothing can come to you except through you. So if a person acts some kind of way in front of you, then the immediate question in that pursuit of self-mastery is, well, what about me would have magnetized this level of shenanigans? I'm trying really hard not to use profanity. I'm on a personal stretch. So this ability to self-explore also takes a certain level of vulnerability that some of us are just not used to. To your point, Giovanni, sometimes it's easier to fall on the weepiness than it is to say, you know what, I dropped the ball, and that wasn't my intention, but clearly it was based on results, and I'm sorry. It's hard to say that. That's very vulnerable to be able to say, I dropped the ball and I disappointed you and I'm sorry. Versus, oh, but you don't understand, and go all telemundo with it, right?
I love it. I just love this. I never heard trust that way. And I don't want to forget it. And
Okay,
likely
write it down.
I just did, but I want, if you don't mind saying a little bit more about it. This is so beautiful. Trust, you said, ability to withstand uncertainty. I've never saw this. I never saw trust as so simple. My ability to withstand uncertainty. And therefore, if I grow the kind of confidence, if you will, or I grow a way to be with it all. I like it how you said it, the universe happens through me or something like that. But my ability to grow in character, to be with it all.
Yeah.
And tolerate uncertainty, then I can trust almost anyone.
Yeah.
Oh, that is mind-blowing. Say a little more about that. Yeah.
So yes, this comes from my own personal, battles with trust. Because in my life, there have been people who have seriously let me down and disappointed me. And one of the ways that we guard ourselves against that level of suffering is to withhold a certain part of us, right? That is like, I'm not going to give you this access to me. I'm not going to be that revelatory. I'm not going to be that available. I'm not going to care too much, because if I give you a piece of my heart and you drop it, it's going to break again. And I can't have another heartbreak, or I can't have another letdown, or whatever the case may be. But I heard myself say that. And then I was like, that's a brittle spirit. I mean, are you that fragile? You haven't gone through any world wars. You have, you know what I mean? So it's like, in the comparison of our collective human suffering, right? I think it's a little bit arrogant to be able to say like, this is how much suffering I'm willing to stand. And usually your suffering is inversely proportional to your preferences or to your attachments. So to the degree that somebody doesn't meet my preferences or my attachments, then they let me down. And it's like, but I invented those. So now we're operating this relationship or this dynamic based on something that I made up. And there may be here's the other thing that I'll say about that, is that nobody is ever a villain in their own story. They may be a villain in your story, but in their own, main character energy, baby. Protagonist, not villain, right? And so I started to get curious, Gio. If they're not the bad guy in the story they tell themselves about themselves, what are they telling themselves? Because I'm sitting over here feeling really hurt and let down and disappointed and betrayed and humiliated and embarrassed and all the other things that the reasons why we don't trust people. And they're over there just minding their clean color business like nothing happened. What's the difference? And I decided that the difference was that some people do what they do because of so for self-protection. In fact, the unwillingness to trust is self-protection, right? So they may have felt like they had to protect their time, they had to protect their resources, they had to protect their heart, they had to protect their energy, they had to protect something such that they did what they did, and it landed the way that it landed on me. But the way that it landed on me was based on my preferences and my attachments, not because they were trying to harm me. And so that opened me up to redefine trust, to be able to say, okay, I don't know how this is going to go, and I'm going anyway. And the reason I'm going anyway is not because I know how you're going to act, but because I know how I'm going to act, regardless of how you show up. And that for me gave me a certainty that it was like, okay, well, let's move forward. Does that make any sense? Does that explain it further?
Yes, can I ask a question about that?
Of course.
So in an area in which I have been accused of insensitivity, being insensible.
Yeah.
And it happens often, to my embarrassment.
Okay.
Yes, it's terrible. Is that I sort of bring perspective to pain often.
Uh-huh.
And so I couldn't language it the way you did, but I look at life and how easy it is for me and for some of the people around my life that I am insensitive to their way of looking at their pain. And so, and I'm often accused of being a jerk about it. Like, oh, come on, get over it. You know, you were not going through a world war, okay? So,
right.
your relationship with your internal state, your relationship with the way you feel, it is, I say that, with the way you feel, it's very weak. You got to straighten up your relationship with yourself. So I ignore it. And I think I'm doing good by being that way, but I'm not.
It doesn't land like, yeah.
I land like a jerk. So how do you look, absent of people like me?
Yeah.
I feel that there's no access for some people to level up, to grow up. But also people like me are not heard. So therefore we make no difference. What any thoughts on,
yeah, I get what you're
inside
saying.
of your umbrella of the context in
Yeah,
which
yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, you are. I think sometimes this goes along the lines of the preferences and attachments that I was talking about earlier. There may be times when I am just another drop in the bucket for someone. And then there are times when that, whatever that drop is, when it happens to tip the bucket over. And so sometimes we think if I really did make a difference, the bucket would tip over. That's how I know I've made a difference. But you did make a difference.
That's fucking beautiful, by the way.
You wouldn't, right?
That's just awesome.
The one that tipped the bucket over couldn't have tipped it over if you hadn't come in 3 years prior, 3 weeks prior, 3 hours prior. You know what I mean? So all of it makes a difference. Each one of those drops in the bucket make a difference, and they're necessary in order for the tipping point to arrive.
That's
All we
beautiful.
can do is give our contribution, and then what they do with it and how it lands and the timing of their transformation, et cetera, that's up to them and the God of their understanding.
Mm. It's all, here's what I'm getting from this conversation. Something I'm getting, not what I am getting, but something about this conversation. In many ways, it's all a risk. It's what Helen Keller was saying in her quote. It's either nothing or everything. It's a risk. And wow, that's so great.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So
vulnerability is the way to go. I mean, if you're going to bet on something, bet on vulnerability, you know?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Because the worst that can happen, short of death, okay, we're not talking about death and destruction here, but the worst that can happen to your ego, being wrong is the worst kind of death. Right? Or being insignificant is the worst kind of death. But the worst that could happen is that you're just a drop in the bucket.
Mm.
That's the worst that can happen. And the best that can happen is that you're the drop in the bucket that tips it over, right? So the challenge, I think, and I'm going to extend this challenge to everybody here in our audience, is that check in, and this is why I always say audit your assumptions, right? Check in with when somebody triggers you, or when somebody lets you down, or when you feel disappointed about something, et cetera. Check in to see if what they've stepped on is one of your preferences or attachments. Like, did they really do a disappointing thing, or did they just not meet a preference or an attachment? Because then what the invitation is, well, how about you unhook from your preferences and attachments? Not all the time, not forever, but enough to be able to extend grace to that person instead of having them like the enemy or having them like the problem.
It's
Make
so
sense
it's
what I'm
so
saying?
much easier for me to extend that invitation. Like, Monikah, just let me be in an open relationship. Come on, let go, let go, let go the preference and attachment to this
Yeah, exclusive
world.
thing.
It's so
Yes.
much easier to extend it rather than when somebody asks me to let go my attachment. That takes something, and I think that could be something we can talk about. You can talk about also how to let go one's attachments. And there's a hand up, by the way.
Yes. Let me see. Who's that? Samsung SM.
It's me, CC. I love this topic.
I see.
This is awesome. It's causing me to pause and think about my reactions because, when I've done this, people have called me on something and that wasn't right. And I said, oh, I was just playing. And really, that was not the truth. The truth is, I should have just told the truth and said, yes, I misspoke. I was wrong. I mean, it wasn't correct. And really, that would have freed me in my mind for having to lie to cover up for my ego trying to be right. So I'm practicing being integrity with myself first and God and everybody else too, because they are deserving of the truth instead of that fake.
Oh, how juicy, how juicy. Thank you for bringing that up, Cece. Because if you really wanted to take it to the next level, you could say, no, I really didn't mean to be rude. I meant to be rude as a way to assert my superiority over the bullshit that I said it, that you were talking about. I didn't mean that. Sorry. That would be like, oh wow, okay, that level of transparency. We're not used to that. You know what I mean? Yeah, good stuff. Thank you for bringing that up, Cece. And to your point, Gio, yeah, it is. Sometimes we're so attached to our preferences and attachments, valga la redundancia, that we can't even see it because it's part of our identity, right? It's like, it's part of our worldview. So it's like asking a fish to define water. It's like, what water? What are you talking about? This is just the world. This is how it works, And so I get it. that I'm asking you to do something that will probably take Herculean efforts if you haven't done it before, to be able to say, what water is what I'm asking you to do, to define the thing that you're breathing. And, but the opportunity there is that if you can see that what you breathe and what you live in and the worldview that you have and the paradigm in which you live is different than the paradigm in which somebody else lives, that begins to unhook us from this is just the way I am, or this is just the way the world works. And no, it's just the way I have it. The way I have it isn't necessarily the way it is. And then I can see another possibility. Then I can invent another future for myself because I'm not on this track, right? That it's like, I mean, if you've seen train tracks, it's really hard to come off of it. If you've seen the way that they're, you know, that they're organized, that they're architected, it's really hard. It takes a terrible malfunction for a train to come off its tracks once it's on it. And it's the same thing for our consciousness. It's not that it takes a traumatic event or a terrible malfunction. It takes you unhooking from your preferences and attachments in order for you to be able to see a different way, to invent another possibility. And that's the invitation today at the Daily Huddle, Spiritual Matters Thursday, using vulnerability as a superpower, using it as an accelerant to your own transformation. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Remember to love, to give, to laugh generously, to eat more plant-based, dress less, exercise more, sleep at least 7 hours. And of course, check yourself before you wreck yourself. Always audit your assumptions. We love you. We'll see you next time.
Thank you. Thank you. Excellent job.
Thank you, thank you.
Thanks,
Man, that was
everybody.
awesome.
One love, guys, one love.
One love.